He took away something precious. He took a life.
But there was no sympathy for 27-year-old Billy Irick. The jury sentenced him to die in the electric chair.
That I knew when that curtain raised, I'm about to watch a man be, not just die, but be put to death. So could I credibly say to the public, the state of Tennessee did this right? I didn't get to see the whole front end of it.
So many questions linger tonight that will never be answered. Such a senseless thing, him murdering that child. Watching Irick die tonight resolved none of those questions.
And I don't care how many times you kill him. She doesn't come back. So is that justice? To make this mother wait 30-something years for the conclusion of this case?
In 1985, a Knoxville family trusted a friend to care for their 7-year-old daughter for just a short amount of time, but that trust would actually crumble and end up a crime, a devastating crime. Paula Dyer was left in the care of Billy Ray Irick. Hours later, she was found dead inside her home. Irick was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. Now, what followed were decades of legal challenges and fights. In this episode of Behind the Headline, we revisit the murder of that little girl and the long legal fight that eventually ended with Billy Ray Irick being executed in 2018. Former 10 News reporter Jim Matheny sat down with the mother of Paula Dyer. She recounts the heartache and the heartbreak she endured when she learned her daughter had died.
Paula Dyer was Kathy's second child. When Kathy and Kenny Jeffers got married in 1982, they already had several children.
We were kind of like the Brady Bunch.
Paula, the bright straight-A student, loved her big family of brothers and sisters.
Very outgoing and very friendly. She never met a stranger.
Kathy and Kenny Jeffers made ends meet by working odd hours, fixing trucks and feeding truckers.
Kenny was a diesel mechanic, and I was a waitress at Hageman's truck stop.
In 1983, they met Billy Irick, a dishwasher at the Dixie Plaza truck stop. Before long, Billy became a roommate who helped with the kids.
When our house caught fire, he actually saved 2 of the boys from the house. It was like part of the family. The house burned and everybody had to split up. I couldn't get a house big enough where he could stay with us.
Kathy and 5 of the children found a small rental house nearby on Exeter Avenue. Paula's personality quickly made a positive impression on the new neighbors.
There was this woman that lived next door to us. Paula picked flowers and walked over and introduced herself and said, "Can we be friends?" That was what she was like.
The night of April 15th, 1985, Kathy had to work the graveyard shift. Her regular babysitter couldn't stay with the children, so Billy Irick came over instead. But something about him that night made Kathy uncomfortable.
I just had a bad feeling. Something's just not quite like it should be, you know. But I didn't know what it was. So, I stopped at a payphone and called Kenny and asked him to please get back there.
About an hour later, Kenny Jeffers got another call at the truck stop, this time from Billy Irick, who said, "Come home, Paula's not breathing, she won't wake up." When Kenny Jeffers got to the house, he found Paula unconscious on the floor with a pool of blood between her legs. Kenny rushed her to Children's Hospital, where doctors tried to revive Paula for 45 minutes, but she wasn't breathing. There was nothing they could do.
And I kind of went nuts. They finally let me go back there, and I kept trying to wake her up. Kept telling her, "Mommy's here, Mommy's here." And then that's when the chaplain came in and took me into the room to talk to me.
Doctors said the cause of death was asphyxiation. Billy Irick suffocated the life from the little broken body he brutally raped twice.
The 4 boys were in the house, and they heard her screaming, tried to get to her, and couldn't, because he had the bedroom door barricaded. And they still have nightmares. He took away something precious. He took a life.
Police found Irick the next afternoon, hiding beneath the Baxter Avenue Bridge on I-275. Officers said he immediately showed remorse and confessed in writing. Irick was behind bars. and the community rallied to help the Jeffers pay for a funeral they couldn't afford just 2 weeks after losing everything in a house fire. First graders at Beaumont Elementary School pitched in anything they could to help put their new classmate Paula to rest. People held car washes to raise money, and truckers delivered a load of support.
There was so much that everybody did.
The family was able to bury Paula, holding a popular toy she had wanted, a Cabbage Patch doll.
It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
A year and a half later, a jury convicted Irick of first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated rape. Defense attorneys tried to save him from the death penalty by pointing out he was institutionalized with mental illness when he was just 6 years old. But there was no sympathy for 27-year-old Billy Irick. The jury sentenced him to die in the electric chair.
Joining me now are 2 of the journalists who covered the execution of Billy Ray Irick, former News Sentinel reporter Jamie Satterfield, former News Sentinel reporter John North, now WBIR chief investigative producer and reporter. Thank you both for being here.
You're welcome.
1985, this brutal murder happened. Neither of you started covering this story from the beginning. You weren't even in East Tennessee
No,
at the
I
time, were you?
hadn't moved here yet. I think I moved here in '93, and by that point, Billy was on death row.
Yeah. And Jamie, when did you learn of this story and subsequently start covering it?
I became aware of it. Every inmate or defendant who's sentenced to die gets a certain number of appeals. And one of those is called a post-conviction, which happens several years after the original conviction. And so it was essentially when Billy Ray Irick's defense team was trying to spare him from execution that I first started covering the case.
So you pick up this story clearly years after it happened. How did you learn about what we just saw, the background of this case? Because that's often what reporters have to do, is pick up a story well after it starts. How did you get the information that you needed to do to continue telling this story going forth?
Well, I'll speak from BIR's perspective. We had made the decision that we wanted to cover this and that we wanted to have somebody present to witness it because Irick was from Knoxville and this was a Knoxville murder. So I didn't know as much as Jamie indicated. I had to read up on it. That was an old case for me. I also met with one of the detectives who had worked the case and got a pretty thorough briefing from him, including, unfortunately, some crime photos of what
you saw the crime photos from 1985.
What Irick did to Paula, which you can't ever unsee. But I think it had been like 9 years since Tennessee had executed anybody. So for anybody in journalism, this was a big story. This was something that we wanted to focus on. And I know that's why the News Sentinel cared about it, and that's certainly why we cared about it. And there were some other outlets as well.
Jamie, you're from East Tennessee, longtime reporter. Had you heard about the case in 1985, and then, of course, eventually you picked up covering it?
Yeah, I was attending the University of Tennessee in 1985. If I'm doing my math right, yes, 1984 I graduated. And I do remember, I think anybody's attention will turn when you hear about the rape and murder of a 7-year-old. So I remember hearing about the case. My focus was on this poor mother. That's what I think I carried with me. So when I got the opportunity to actually go into a courtroom, I just was very mindful of Paula's mother and what she was having to experience, and how this thing, it's 30 years in the making just to get to the execution. And she's had to live with that entire time.
Yeah. So when you were in the courtroom these different times, was her family there?
Yes, her mother was there. Her father was there at times, I think. But the person that I recognized almost immediately and paid attention to in the courtroom was her mother, Kathy.
Can you imagine so many years having to relive it? I guess every time you go into a courtroom, relive your daughter's death.
Something like 32, I think.
Yes.
And to question yourself, as a mother, we mothers hold ourselves accountable for everything that happens to our children. And I think that's one of the things that's stuck with me, is she had misgivings about Billy Irick babysitting, right? This was really a decision made by the father, stepfather, actually, to Paula. But she had misgivings. She was concerned that night. And then for every fear that she probably had, for this to come true, I just have to imagine that she suffered guilt, that she didn't act on that feeling she had.
Yeah, she talks about that sense that, something just wasn't right, that parental sixth sense, if you will. In this case, in cases of rape, we, in the news, typically do not report the victim's name. This case was different. A little girl died. Explain for our viewers and our listeners, the reason why we don't in some cases, and the reason why we do in some cases report the names of victims.
Well, and Jamie knows as well, because she has spent so many years sitting in courtrooms. We try very, very hard to protect the identities of sexual assault victims of all kinds, needless to say, of children. We absolutely want to do our very best to try and, I like to think about someday that little person's going to grow up and they don't want to look back as an adult and say, oh my gosh, you identified me. So we try really hard, and that even goes to cases, for what it's worth, of incest, because unfortunately that does happen in our society. People do get charged with that crime, but we work doubly hard to try to make sure that whatever we report, you're not going to be able to infer what may have happened. But it's different when you're talking about a homicide. It's different when you're talking about a killing. Suddenly now there's a much bigger question that the public should be knowing about what happened to that innocent victim and who allegedly did it. So in those cases where somebody allegedly has taken the life of the child, perhaps in the commission of a rape, we're going to tell you about that child because you need to know. And furthermore, the state of Tennessee, it's very relevant, may be saying this person ought to face execution, the threat of the death penalty for what they did. And that's exactly what happened in this Irick case.
No doubt. And we've touched on this, but expound on it, if you will. 1985 to 2018, he is charged and he dies. That span of time, 32 years. This is part of the process, though it may be a long process. Everyone who is charged, convicted, has this right to appeal. Is that, 32 years, though. Some people, I guess, may not be able to get their head around that fact, but it is what is granted.
Well, when people tell me they have trouble getting their head around that, what I say is we have executed innocent people in this country. It's been proven. Mm-hmm. And so haste is never good. If the state of Tennessee wanted to speed things up, don't ask for the death penalty. We have life without parole. Mm-hmm. So I don't even think that's a valid argument. It takes what it takes to ensure that justice is served.
And this is about justice.
Right. And it's harder for people to understand when you have a case like this where Billy Ray Irick fairly quickly admitted what he did and, in fact, wanted to come in and just straight up plead guilty. So that can be a little hard to understand. But his defense team had an obligation to look at factors that may have contributed to his actions. And he had an extensive history of mental illness and violence as a result of mental illness from childhood. And so it took some time for that to be explored, for him to be evaluated. Is he competent to stand trial? Was he insane at the time? These are just questions that must be answered as part of this process. And it took time. And meanwhile, in the background, Tennessee's having a little war with itself over the death penalty in general. So there was a time in Tennessee where there have been moratoriums at various points. And so his case was one of those that was affected by that, by the state actually pulling back on executions for various reasons.
And let's talk about that. Why did the state say we're gonna hold executions for the time being?
Well, one reason was that they had to come up with what they were comfortable with in terms of a lethal injection process. And even when they did, it still was really not settled. It was not satisfactory. Irick, by the time we got to Irick in 2018, the state was using a 3-drug mix, if you will. You were out there. You were in the parking lot anchoring our coverage. And that was not even really completely satisfactory to everybody. And as it turned out, and we learned later, Jamie and I learned later, there were some problems with some of the executions that were administered. And this was one. There were questions raised about this one in terms of how the drugs had been handled and treated and properly labeled and the age of them and all of that. But it took a while to get to 2018 where the state of Tennessee was like, okay, 3-drug cocktail, and this is where we're going to go. And, of course, ultimately, they threw that out. And now we are using 1 drug, pentobarbital, as the drug to execute inmates.
I will say, just very quickly, one of the issues in terms of these drugs is that drug makers did not want to be associated with state killing, right?
Right.
And so the state, Tennessee and other states began to struggle to get a supply. And then they didn't want to tell anybody where they're getting it from, which created a lot of questions about both the drugs that were being used and how they were being administered.
There were also questions about the what the inmates might be going through as the drugs are working their way into the system. There was a question about whether one of the drugs was not indeed giving them a sense of drowning. They might be not eyes open, could be eyes closed, but still experiencing that stress of a drowning feeling.
We're going to dig deeper in that because the two of you did witness his execution. But once it was lifted and executions were back on in 2018, Billy Ray Irick was set to die. Our reporter, once again, Jim Matheny, spoke to Kathy Jeffers, Paula's mother, in the weeks leading up to that execution.
It's like it never ends. It's 30-something years ago, and it's still going on.
Since landing on death row in 1986, Irick's case has gone through every appeal from the High Court in Tennessee to the Supreme Court of the United States. Every time, the courts ruled his death sentence would stand. Every time, the courts determined he was mentally competent to pay the ultimate price for his crime. But every time, the broader issues of capital punishment postponed Irick's date with death.
My kids had to go through this. They had to live through it. And now my grandkids, her nieces and nephews, are having to live through it too. The suffering don't stop. It just doesn't stop. I'm sick of hearing about his pain and his suffering. This one doctor says his so-called panic attacks if he's given this injection. She was 7 years old, raped, sodomized, and strangled to death. I'm sorry, I feel nothing for his panic attacks or his pain. Nothing at all. God forgive me, but I don't. I don't.
Those many years after her child's death, you can still hear the agony that she is experiencing. It's profound for sure. Jamie, as we mentioned, you were in the courtroom in the lead up to him finally being executed, the many different hearings and appeals that he was granted. What was his demeanor over the years?
You know, when you think about the fact that he was 26 at the time of this killing, and so he's a young man, relatively physically healthy, strong. Over time, we saw him age. So the man that walks into the courtroom, however many years later that I'm covering that post-conviction, looks nothing like the man that was convicted of this crime. Just being behind bars, they get kind of pasty white, and your hair's very unkempt. But he was always very quiet, kept his head down largely. He rarely spoke up or appeared to take any interest in what was going on. Mm-hmm. That struck me in that the thought being, when this many years have elapsed, is the person that you're putting to death the same person that committed the crime, if that makes sense. He has aged decades now, right, behind bars. So I found that interesting to kind of juxtapose the man who did this and the way he looked and acted and moved through the world, and the fellow that we actually ended up executing. He was an older guy at that point.
Yeah. An execution date is set August 9th, 2018. But in the lead up to that, there is an appeal, if you will, of journalists, of witnesses who are asked to witness the execution. That came out, and you two answered that call to witness the execution of Billy Ray Irick. What brought you to that decision of this is a duty? It is a duty as a journalist to witness and be the eyes of the public. But what propelled you both to make that decision?
Well, Tennessee law says there need to be official witnesses to an execution, and journalists are typically who they turn to. Again, here at the station, we knew this was coming up, and so there was discussion, not light at all. Well, who would be willing to witness this? And not a lot of people stepped up. As one of the older people in the room, I said, well, I'll do it if that's what you want. I'm fine to do that. Like Jamie, we have seen all kinds of things in our decades of covering, so I suppose you build up a little bit of calluses to the bad news that you have to write about and see. So I said, okay, that's fine. I'm happy to do that. And what do they have? They do like a drawing or whatever, depending on how many people. Candidly, not a lot of people want to watch someone die, which is a good thing. So, but it was us, maybe another station, I think, from Knoxville. And that's how I got involved in it.
Jamie?
My feeling was, if I'm going to write about juries ruling that death is the appropriate punishment, that it's really almost only natural that I follow that all the way through. And for me in particular, because there was some controversy around the method, and my goodness, have we changed methods over the years, right? One method has fallen, another one's fallen. You look back now and think about electric chair execution. And we look at that today and go, that's god-awful. That's not the way to do this, right? But at the time, so I felt a real responsibility to witness how executions are being carried out and what actually happens, and to be able to explain that to the public so they can make an informed decision about capital punishment in general, but also whether our laws were fairly executed in this particular case.
Yes, it's for the protection of all that people are watching and witnessing. Well, the three of us were at Riverbend maximum security facility in Nashville on the day of August 9th, 2018. This is our coverage from that day in the lead up to the execution of Billy Ray Irick. We are about 2 hours away from the time Billy Ray Irick is set to die. His execution will take place here at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. This after the U.S. Supreme Court said it will not intervene in the case. I'm Robin Wilhoit live in front of Riverbend, where outside it is relatively quiet. You have media set up to cover the execution, but inside this facility, there's been a flurry of activity as prison officials prepare for the 8 o'clock execution of Billy Ray Irick. Irick was sentenced to death back in 1986 for the murder and rape of 7-year-old Paula Dyer. He babysat Paula and her brothers who were home the night she was killed. If he is executed tonight, he will be the state's first to die by lethal injection here since 2009. Irick has been on death row now for 32 years. The original judge in the case, Jimmy Duncan, we had the opportunity to speak with him. He, of course, went on to serve in Congress for 3 decades, but we talked to him today about this case and this execution. Here's 10 News reporter Mark Salinger.
It's been 32 years since Billy Ray Irick walked into Judge Jimmy Duncan's courtroom.
I think that justice has been done, finally, and that we waited too many years to do it.
32 years since a jury found him guilty of raping and murdering 7-year-old Paula Dyer. More than 3 decades later, now Congressman Jimmy Duncan says it's time for Irick to die.
I've never lost any sleep over it. I can tell you this, I'm satisfied that he was given every right that he was entitled to, and the poor little girl wasn't given any kind of life at all. Her life was just taken away from her.
In his 7.5 years on the bench, Judge Duncan presided over more than 10,000 cases. He says Irick's case was one of the most gruesome he ever saw.
It has to be a horrible, terrible case to get a jury to hand a death sentence down. And the jury did that in this case, and I agreed with him.
Irick was sentenced in 1986. Duncan says 32 years is far too long for the convicted killer to wait on death row.
I hope the day will come when we can do these things much quicker and we don't allow people to appeal for 30 or 32 years.
Tonight, Duncan's focus will be on justice for 7-year-old Paula Dyer.
The victim, of course, had the worst possible thing happen to her. Her life was snuffed out. This man's had 32 extra years of living.
Irick made her suffer, Duncan says. Tonight,
if he has to go through a little pain, I don't really have a lot of sympathy for that.
He'll finally face the ultimate punishment. Mark Salinger, WBIR 10 News.
So, the time has come. Let's walk through what you all remember from that day in the lead up to the execution. Explain how that day played out once you arrived at Riverbend.
Well, you know, the immediate thing is you have to go through security, which just seems so odd to me. You all are inviting me in to witness an execution, but we went through security, and then they hustle us into the initial room I went into. Was just a small, I don't know what the purpose of the room was.
Pretty sterile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but attorneys who had represented Mr. Irick were there. Then Sheriff Jimmy J.J. Jones was in that room. Of course, a journalist. There was probably a guard or two. I just remember how quiet everybody was, you know.
Very subdued.
Yeah. You know, JJ in particular is kind of a cut-up, and it struck me that was one of the few times I saw him genuinely subdued. And then, as they moved us out of that room, and how much time elapsed, couldn't tell you. I felt like we were in these places forever. But I remember, too, that they then escort us, and you're sort of going through this empty cafeteria, and there are guards kind of lined up, almost as you're walking through, like the UT walk. But they, too, were very somber. It was, respectful, I think, is the word that I kept. It's a terrible situation for everyone. Mm-hmm. But I found that level of respect at the prison, and to honor the seriousness of what it was about to take place. I think it affected my mood, honestly. And then they move us into the room in which there are curtains. It's totally black in there. The walls were black, I think, or at least it was really dark.
It was grim.
And there was a curtain that was down. And two things hit me. One is that I knew when that curtain raised, I'm about to watch a man be not just die, but be put to death. But also, the way the layout is you have the room we were in, so say here, and then this area, a wall, is where the family would be. So we could see them diagonally once they opened the curtains. But I kept thinking about Kathy as we're sitting there,
Yeah.
waiting for those curtains to rise. Being told nothing, by the way.
You're just waiting.
Yes. So I'll let John kind of give his impression of that.
Well, first of all, by the way, when you go into a prison, they don't let you bring a whole lot of stuff in, right?
You couldn't bring your phones
No,
or anything
no.
like that,
and,
right?
And what it does is it sort of takes away a part of who you are when they're like, no, you can't have that. So that's a very off-putting, surreal feeling. Remember, they gave us notepads and pencils, and that's it. And I remember them handing me a pencil thinking, but I write a lot. That lead's going to go dull pretty quick, but whatever. And the other thing that struck me before we went into the witness chamber was, you mentioned that cafeteria where we sat for a little while, which was a little bit warmer than the prior room we'd been in. But then when they let us and finally said, okay, now, well, I don't even know if they said anything, to be honest with you. When they led us from the cafeteria to what turned out to be the witness chamber, it was not far away at all. Do you remember that?
No, right around the corner.
We like went through a hallway to a door, and they opened the door, and I'm like, I don't know, my mind is weird, I guess. I was like, wow, this is where they execute people basically almost within shouting distance of where everybody gathers to eat food and what have you. It's just kind of a macabre thought. But like Jamie said, we sat, all of us who were witnesses, we sat in that room with the lights off and the blinds down for about 40 or 45 minutes, and we're just waiting. That's all you know. You're just sitting there waiting. And because of the context of the situation, you don't know if it's appropriate to communicate at all or not. Was I sitting next to you?
I think so.
I think I was. I don't even remember if we said anything, and we've been friends for 30-plus years. And then they finally turned the mic on, didn't they? So we began to hear there's a microphone in the execution chamber, which, as Jamie says, the blinds are blocking the window, which is our view into the execution chamber. But we can start to hear sounds, chains rattling. It's kind of almost was, I hadn't thought about this before, it's almost kind of like a Christmas carol when you hear Marley's chains rattling. You could
Activity
hear that.
going on,
Yeah,
yeah.
you know something's happening. What's happening is they're bringing him in and strapping him down on the gurney. But then, as Jamie says, about 7:25 that night, Central Time, they raise the blinds.
And as you all are sitting there and the blinds are going up, myself and Leslie Ackerson,
Right.
another reporter, she was covering it from outside in front of Riverbend. And you talk about just kind of subdued, even outside. I recall
I'm sure.
this subdued feeling, this just sadness, is that the right word, of heaviness,
Oh, yeah.
knowing what is going to happen. Now, we were not aware of the timing. We were just waiting for the person to come forward outside to us and say that the execution had taken place. But that waiting, was very palatable. I even remember that feeling to this day. Back inside, though, the curtain goes up.
When the curtain goes up, now I expected that we were going to see the entirety of this process.
Yeah, no, we
You
didn't.
didn't? Okay.
You know, for instance, did he get to talk to a chaplain? Was there prayer? Was there, you know, these things you see on movies?
Right.
So when the curtains go up, he's already on the gurney, strapped down with, you know, the hookups necessary to carry this execution out. So we did not get to see them install. The word is escaping me for the needle you put in your arm to do that, but we didn't see any of that.
Everything was really just set to go.
Everything was done. He was strapped down onto the gurney, and so in some ways it felt very quick to me. In that I was expecting an entire process. So could I credibly say to the public, the state of Tennessee did this right? I didn't get to see the whole front end of it. So that was something right away that I found bothersome. If my role is supposed to be as a witness to ensure that the execution was carried out properly.
We're going to get into where we are now, where that is concerned, in just a few minutes. But John, tasked as a reporter, Jamie as a reporter, you are watching everything play out as closely as you can, and you recounted this for WBIR. Share some
Sure.
of what you wrote.
Well, I had kind of thought, I wonder if maybe I ought to write a little something when we get done. I don't know what you did when you went back after that, but when we went back to our hotel rooms, I thought, well, you know, maybe I'll just kind of write my thoughts out, because it is kind of something that you don't see every day. This is toward the end of the story that I wrote, which I think was called Witness to an Execution. And it says, after 33 years, Irick finally paid what a Knox County jury said was the proper price for raping and killing 7-year-old Paula. If no one claims his body, perhaps he'll end up in a pauper's grave. I'll be curious to see how I feel as the days progress, but right now, some 4 hours after it happened, writing this story in the middle of the night, I'm thinking more about Paula. Her mother told us she was a genuinely sweet little girl who cared about others and loved to make friends. She even cared about Billy Irick, who had babysat her many times before he inexplicably attacked her in her parents' bed the night of April 15, 1985, while they were gone from the house. So many questions linger tonight that will never be answered. Such a senseless thing, him murdering that child. Watching Irick die tonight resolved none of those questions. Some people have told us at WBIR that Irick should have been executed long ago, that he didn't deserve to live as long as he did. He's gone now. I'll leave it for others to decide if justice was served.
And I will say that, so I had a lot of roles that evening. One of the things that the witnesses, and John had to do this as well, is we have to go out and report literally to the public. There are other media outlets. You were out.
I was out on the other side of the podium.
That's weird.
And so we had to speak about what we saw. And then for me personally, I had to then go to the Knox News' sister publication, to the Tennessean, there in Nashville. And so I had some work there. So, you know, contributing to a written story. We did, I believe, a video. So there was a lot that kept me busy. But Kathy kept staying on my mind. In fact, while the execution's taking place, I kept straining to try to see if I could see her. Because again, as a mother, she has always been my focus in this. So when it was hours and hours later, my phone died. I remember that. I couldn't call in. But when I finally got back to my hotel room, I could not get Kathy off my mind. And so while the Tennesseans kind of putting to bed that initial coverage, I wrote a piece specifically for the East Tennessee audience. It ran in, I'm sure the Tennessean ran it, but it ran in the Sentinel, as I will always call it. I'm sorry. But one of the things, what I kind of hung that column on was, we try to sometimes clean up language. I wanted to state very plainly what happened to that little girl, and that her siblings heard her screaming and could not do anything. The door's locked. They can't get in. They're pounding on the door. Because we forget the true, it's easy to say brutal killing and rape. Every killing and rape is brutal. But this one, because of the role of children in it, but also Billy Ray Irick is a monster, but he wasn't born a monster. And so I also tried, I didn't spend a lot of time on that, but I noted that. And then I talked about how the man laying on that gurney is not the man that killed that child, right? I mean, this has been 30-something years later. Don't know what's been going on in his head, his heart, his mind. No, we don't know. But it's so far removed from the crime itself. And I kind of ended it with Kathy walking out of that prison without her daughter. And I don't care how many times you kill him. She doesn't come back. So is that justice? To make this mother wait 30-something years for the conclusion of this case. I honestly, and this will not be popular, I have been a strong death penalty advocate, witnessing the execution, thinking about what that mother's experienced over that amount of time, really made me a proponent for life without parole, because the appeal process ends and you're done. As a surviving victim, you are done. And you can try to move on and build your life. This woman, for 30-something years, had to wait and wait and wait and wait. And for what? So we could say, oh, we got revenge. That's not what the justice system is even about. So do I shed tears for Billy Ray Irick? No. I might shed a tear for the young boy that should have gotten treatment. But no, it's not about having sympathy for killers. It is the death penalty, does it really achieve anything for those most affected? I would argue it doesn't. And my final thing I will say is that I watched my husband die. So I know what death looks like. Billy Ray Irick's death, although there is some question about whether he suffered and could not communicate that suffering because of the drugs. But it was quick, and it wasn't quite as dramatic as one might think.
There was no distress. He was not in distress.
He strained. You could see the purple veins, right? So it was almost like you see a bodybuilder, picking up these big weights. That was what you could see on his face and arms and shoulders, was the strain. But that was the most activity, I would say, that I saw.
I think one of the witnesses who was with us felt like he probably had suffered. I don't know if he suffered or not. There was a moment where, when he was on the gurney, he kind of rose up. I mean, he was unconscious, I guess. He sort of popped up and then went back down. Was that involuntary? I don't know. I don't know if you've thought about this, but the philosophy about seeking the death penalty has changed a lot over the last 5-10 years, and you don't see DAs going as often for death in cases. And this is a case today where I think if it happened today, I don't know if this would be a death case or not. and I'm not saying it wasn't horrible, but I'm not sure that it would be a death case. I don't know. We don't seek death as often as we used to.
And for probably a host of reasons.
There are a lot of
for
reasons.
sure, no doubt. This was mentioned. I'm going to bring it back up. You all witnessed the execution from the moment the curtains came up, and at that moment you saw Billy Ray Irick on laying down and ready for the injections. There's an effort, and WBIR is a part of this effort, to make that even more transparent. Explain what is underway
Sure.
right now, John.
Last year, multiple media companies, including Tegna, which owns us, and I think some newspaper companies as well, joined in this effort led by Paul McAdoo with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press to widen the sort of what we could see, what witnesses could see. As Jamie said, we saw him from the moment he'd already been strapped in to the gurney. They hadn't started feeding him the drugs yet. And we did not see the doctor declare him dead.
That's right.
The blinds were brought down after he stopped moving. He was purple because blood had stopped circulating in his body. He was dead, we all felt. But they brought the blinds down, and then they brought the doctor in to formally declare him dead. And the warden came on at that point in the intercom and said that he had been declared dead. So this process, the idea is, and the press, the media has been successful so far, although Paul tells me now the state has filed some kind of an appeal, which doesn't shock me in the least. TDOC is very particular about their protocols, and I don't think they would like anything to be changed from what it is. But what we asked for as the media was, let's see, for example, the moment that he's brought into the execution chamber. Let's see him when he comes in and then is seated, if it's going to be the electric chair, or put it on the gurney if it's going to be pentobarbital. And let's watch the whole thing through to the point where the doctor formally declares the inmate dead. A chancellor has agreed with that, upheld that, but now it sounds like the state is appealing that, so it's not settled law.
And understand that DOC would prefer there are no media.
Yeah, they don't want
Exactly.
anybody anywhere near. I mean,
But that is our job.
Right.
That is our job.
and we should be there. The public needs to be there.
Absolutely.
We operate as the public.
And look, carrying out an execution is an enormous expense. That's taxpayer dollars. How that's conducted is certainly in the interest of every taxpayer in the state of Tennessee.
Well, as I said at the start, we didn't know it at the time, but questions were later raised when the state went back and took a look at some of the executions that happened. Starting with Irick, there were some questions there about sort of the way the drugs had been stored and kept track of and what have you. So, I mean, you know, it's a legitimate reason. And we know in other states, like the state of Oklahoma, there have been botched executions. And you need to know, the public needs to know, if the state is going to act to take a person's life away, that's profound, legally speaking, and there have to be witnesses to something like that.
To wrap us up, as we look back on this case, so many years in the making, as a journalist, what is the takeaway, if you will, Jamie?
I think for me, the takeaway is that violence against women and children has been happening since the beginning of time and continues today. And this poor child suffered horrendously before she died. And I understand how that can engender the sense of retribution. Somebody must pay. But it doesn't bring Paula back, and it doesn't really give Kathy any kind of real justice. She still has this empty space where her daughter was. And killing Billy Ray Irick didn't change that. locking him away for the rest of his life would ensure the safety of the public. So this is just one of those cases where I've felt strongly about now that we have an option that allows us to lock away violent people for the rest of their life, why are we spending money and time and emotion on executions?
Well, you know, it's a very unique thing that we do in society. A lot of nations would say it's utterly disgusting what happens when the United States puts an inmate down. Others would be fine with it. It is the law. It is what we do. Not every state does an execution. Many states do not. I've covered cases where I've had serial killers that I've covered, and you know, in Tennessee that would have been a death case, but in the state of Kansas, no, it was not. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm maybe not as enlightened as Jamie, because what I would tell you is, it is the process. It is what we do. It is what we collectively want, apparently, as a people in the state of Tennessee. It is not ever anything that we should take lightly or for granted. We have a number of inmates who are set to be executed this year. Mm-hmm. I think there's one in May, and there's a Knoxville case that is set to go through in late September. So we will see. But it is part of what we as a society think is proper, at least a majority so far.
John, Jamie, as always, thank you for being with us to share your experience as journalists. Never easy to talk about, but important for us all to hear. So thank you. And thank you for watching. If you would like to see past episodes of Behind the Headline, you can check them out on WBIR Plus, our streaming app. Also, you can listen on Apple and Spotify. Once again, thank you for watching. We'll see you for the next episode of Behind the Headline.